Hello and welcome to the Texas Tribune TribCast for Tuesday, October 14th. I am Matthew Watkins, editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune, joined as usual by politics and justice reporter Eleanor Klibanoff.
Hello, still not my title. Law and politics.
Law and politics, politics and justice.
Politics, Law and Order and CSI and Justice and politics reporter. Yeah.
I will get it at some point,
Yeah.
or maybe I won't.
Yeah,
The
maybe
bit
not. Yeah.
Keeps working.
Mm-hmm.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. There's a real fall chill in the air.
Oh yeah, low 90s.
Yeah,
this
it's
week.
amazing.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that at ACL Fest.
Yeah,
this past
were you at ACL?
I was, and
Did you see
I continue
T-Pain?
to be too old for this.
Yeah.
No, I only went on Saturday with my daughter and my wife. Daughter very excited to see Sabrina Carpenter. I went and saw The Strokes because, as previously mentioned, I am old and am much more
It's
interested
very
in
on
seeing The
brand.
Strokes.
Yeah.
Matthew.
Yes.
instead. But it was a great time.
You just threw your daughter into the Sabrina crowd and we're like, we'll meet back at the end.
Yeah, well, so basically, my daughter had a soccer game at 8 a.m. in San Antonio.
Ugh.
So we had to wake up at 6 and drive her to San Antonio. Then we drove back, and then we got to the festival at around 2:30, and then ended up getting home around like midnight. So it was an incredibly long day, and my daughter was like, "This is too much." So they actually stayed back and weren't in the mix.
Fair.
But I was watching the Strokes and also watching the Texas A&M football game on my phone.
Yeah,
So.
fair. That it's like the first part so beautiful, like getting to share a music festival with your child.
Yeah.
The setup of after driving her at 6 a.m. to a soccer game is like a real mixed bag on parenthood as
Yeah.
as
And
an
then she was like
undertaking.
convinced that she had lung cancer because of all the people who were smoking. And I was like, actually, that pain you feel in your lungs is actually all the dust. kicked
Right.
up.
Yeah, you're like,
But
you can
anyways.
smoke a ton. Don't even worry, babe. Like, honestly, the smoking's not the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, anyways.
Nice.
Yeah.
I did not go to ACL this year, but most would have gone to see T-Pain.
I went to the first 10 ACL fests,
Oh.
and then I retired.
Okay.
Because I was like, it's too much. And then I went enough since then to forget how terrible it is.
Yeah,
and
every
then-
time
and
it's
then I
a
came
new.
back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was actually pretty fun.
Yeah.
Japanese Breakfast actually was the best show. If anyone is
Oh,
familiar
yeah.
with that band,
Yeah.
really great.
Yeah. Did you go to ACL?
I did. I had a very chaotic experience. I did not have tickets, so me and my friends got there Sunday at 4 p.m. and I held up a sign that said "Need 4 wristbands." The scalpers were quoting us like $400 for like 5 hours left of the festival. So we posted up at Lou's and I held up my sign. Eventually did manage to get 2, so I went in and saw 2 DJs.
Interesting.
I will say, I've said it before, I'll say it again. Kayla, we're very different people.
That voice you heard
Yes.
was indeed Kayla Guo, our politics reporter.
Yes.
I know Kayla's title.
Yeah,
Correct.
more straightforward.
Yeah,
I had to
fewer.
get fancy.
But this week, she is here to talk to us about Robert Roberson, who was, at least coming into this week when we scheduled this podcast, scheduled to be put to death by the state of Texas for the 2003 conviction for killing his daughter. His case, as you may know, has become a high-profile cause for death penalty opponents who believe Texas might be trying to execute an innocent man. But on Thursday, the state's highest criminal court delayed the execution for the second time in less than a year. It was the second time in less than a year that Roberson was essentially days away from being executed, and a court stepped in to block it. All through this whole process, really this whole past year, some of Texas's highest profile politicians have been fighting over the Roberson case in a fight that sort of breaks down under sort of non-ideological lines. It's been sort of an interesting mix of lawmakers on both sides of the issue. But I will speak for myself. I won't speak for you, Eleanor, but at least for myself, as this fight has been going on, it's been a bit challenging to sort of make sense of the facts. I would say both sides seem very certain and confident in their position as to whether Robert Roberson did this. So, Kayla, you are here to break it down for us. Thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Even after an eventful ACL festival. So let's just start with the basics here. Can you tell us about the crime that Roberson is accused of?
Yes, he is accused and was convicted of murdering his 2-year-old daughter, Nikki. He was convicted in 2003. She died in 2002. And at the time when he brought her to the hospital, the nurses and doctors, he had said that he had woken to find her fallen from the bed and she was unresponsive, but he didn't know what was going on. She had been really sick in the weeks leading up to that. But at the hospital, the doctors and nurses didn't think that, a fall could have caused this. And so they saw the signs that at the time told them to diagnose her with shaken baby syndrome, which is basically when a child or a baby is shaken so violently that they are really injured or die. So that is what he was convicted of in 2003. He has maintained his innocence over the past 20 plus years on death row. But even at his trial, his defense lawyer didn't pursue that innocence claim, didn't, defend him as if believing that he were innocent. And so now, medical consensus has evolved. His lawyers have presented evidence they say debunks that shaken baby diagnosis and that there was no crime.
Okay, let's get into that now. Why do the people who believe he's innocent believe he is innocent?
There is a lot. So in the midst of all this, Texas in 2013 passes a pretty groundbreaking law, the junk science law. Texas was the first in the nation to do it. A bunch of states have followed suit. And that provides for second looks in cases where the conviction rested on science that has since been discredited. It recognizes that while the law is final and, convictions are final, science and evidence evolves. Like you think of things like bite mark hypotheses. People used to think that you could match someone's teeth up to a bite mark, and that is just not held up in science anymore. So we passed this law in 2013 that Roberson's supporters think he is the poster child to receive relief under. And so a few things have happened since then as well. The medical guidance doesn't say to diagnose shaken baby syndrome when the 3 symptoms that it previously said to do appear for. It says you have to consider other factors before concluding abuse. His lawyers argue that things like sicknesses, accidents, those can cause these 3 symptoms as well. It's bleeding behind the retina, some things in the brain, swelling, bleeding. And so the medical consensus around how to diagnose shaken baby syndrome, it's still real. A baby can still be really injured if they're violently shaken. Today, it's not called shaken baby syndrome anymore. But how to diagnose this, that guidance has changed. And his lawyers also point to evidence about Nikki that wasn't considered at trial as closely, that she was, really sick in the days leading up to it, that she was prescribed medication that's no longer given to children her age. And they also point to flaws with how the autopsy was conducted, things with how Nikki was handled at the hospital. So there are just a bunch of different evolving, shifting things that have led people to say that it's not totally clear that he shook his baby to death and should be executed for it.
Right, there's sort of correct me if I'm wrong, right? But 2 separate things here. One of which is the actual facts of his specific case, and also, as you were saying, this consensus on shaken baby syndrome.
Right.
That the junk science law doesn't say, oh, if you were convicted on something that has since been thrown out as you can't possibly have done it. It just says you should get a second look at your case, right, and we'll reassess it on modern medicine. And a big part of that is the idea that what we now know is doctors used to be told, pediatricians especially, if you see these 3 symptoms, the triad, assume it's shaken baby syndrome and proceed from there, which sort of his lawyers have already sort of taint the whole thing from the jump. We now know that a lot of things can cause that, and that often to shake a baby so hard to cause them to die, you might see other symptoms too, like a broken neck or something.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, it's well, actually, I want to go back a little bit and more into the arguments on both sides here, but let's kind of continue with our history lesson first, right? So he was scheduled to be executed last year, and 2 state lawmakers really took up his cause. Jeff Leach, a Republican from the Collin County area north of Dallas, and Joe Moody, a Democrat from the El Paso area. Tell us a little bit about the dramatic actions they took to block the execution the first time here last year.
Yeah. Well, I just want to note last year was not the first time his execution was blocked.
Oh.
The Court of Criminal Appeals in 2016 actually stayed his execution using the junk science law, saying that it provided a second look. So his case went back to trial court. They had an evidentiary hearing, but the court in Anderson County and the prosecutor, maintained that the evidence was still convincing of his guilt, and so that's what they recommended to the CCA, and the CCA agreed. Roberson's lawyer thinks that they never really meaningfully engaged with all the evidence she brought up, but that sort of covers the span between 2016 up until 2023 is when his execution date is set for 2024, last year, which is when all these lawmakers get involved and sort of set off this broader, more dramatic political saga. I think it was in the month before his execution was set to take place, more than half, I think it was something like 2/3 of the Texas House sign on to a letter urging clemency. A few people have since walked back their support, like Tom Oliverson, Briscoe Kane. But these lawmakers, they were suggesting that maybe there was sufficient doubt to put a pause on the whole thing. The House Committee on Criminal Jurisprudence, which at the time Joe Moody chaired, and I believe Jeff Leach was the vice chair at the time, they held a couple hearings before the execution was set to happen. And then the most dramatic moment happened the day before Roberson was set to be executed. They brought in a bunch of experts to testify. It was an all-day hearing. Sometime in the middle of the day, the decision came from the Board of Pardons and Paroles that they were going to reject his application for clemency, which meant that only Governor Greg Abbott had the power at the time to, issue a 30-day stay, which he did not do. At the end of this long all-day hearing, the committee, I believe it was a motion by Representative Brian Harrison, who's a Republican from Midlothian, he raises this motion to subpoena Robert Roberson, instructing him to come testify before the committee a few days after he was scheduled to die. So that sets off a whole whirlwind the next day. And eventually the Texas Supreme Court steps in saying that this is a separation of powers issue between the executive and legislative branches of government should the subpoena win out or the executive branch's authority to execute him win out. And that leads to his execution being temporarily stayed. And eventually the Supreme Court says the lawmakers stepped a little bit too far. And Robert's execution was put back on the calendar this year and until last week was set to happen in 2 days from when we're recording.
And the idea back then there was essentially you can't execute someone who we're asking to come testify before us. Abbott.
Where you can't testify if you've been executed.
Exactly.
So
right. You can't execute. We need him to
to answer questions.
So don't and Abbott and others basically essentially make the case that this is sort of they are taking away the power of the governor to kind of make decisions on these when it's essentially the
right. Anyone could subpoena anyone then and say, we're never going to execute anybody.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So then the decision from the State Criminal Court of Appeals, we should mention a 9-member court, all Republicans, all elected statewide that focus on basically the top criminal court in the state, issues a decision on Thursday. Tell us what that decision said.
That decision, so first of all, it didn't rule on the merits of Roberson's claims that, this was junk science or that Nikki died from other causes. It in fact dismissed a bunch of his appeals, claiming judicial misconduct and other things. But it told the trial court in Anderson County to look again at Robert's case in light of a decision the criminal court made last year. So in the midst of all of the subpoena stuff going on and the Court of Criminal Appeals overturned the conviction of a man out of Dallas County who was convicted based on a shaken baby syndrome diagnosis. In that decision, the Court of Criminal Appeals, acknowledged that the science and medical consensus around shaken baby syndrome had evolved since that conviction. And so they overturned that guy's conviction. His name was Andrew Rourke, And Robert's attorneys had been, citing that case as if you're going to acknowledge changing science in Andrew Rourke's case. We think it should apply here as well. Robert's attorney, Gretchen Swen, called the cases materially indistinguishable, and so that had been a point in her filings to the court since then. And so on Thursday, the CCA told the trial court to look at Roberson's case again in light of that particular decision. It didn't say, this is junk science. It didn't say there are a lot of things wrong with this. It just said, since we've made that decision, we want you to look at this again in light of that. And so now, things will happen at the trial court level in Anderson County, and whether Roberson gets a new trial at the end of it is sort of TBD. But
right, so they didn't necessarily order a new trial. They said review based on this sort of precedent we set in a previous case.
Exactly.
And at this point, currently, right, the Attorney General's office has sort of stepped in to Anderson County to say, like, they're taking the role of Anderson County in defending this. And as we know, Attorney General Ken Paxton has been very, very outspoken about the idea that Roberson should be executed for this crime.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the argument being made by people like Attorney General Ken Paxton that, Mitch Little, a state representative, another person really pushing this case, that essentially, people are portraying, people in the media, people who are in the legislature who are trying to defend him, lawyers, are trying to portray this as some kind of open and shut case when the evidence actually points to a clear guilt of Roberson.
Right, like a murderer would walk free.
And I wanted to see if you can help me sort of think through what some of the cases, and I'll warn here, we might go into the realm of fairly graphic details here. So of a very young child. So if people don't want to listen to this, you might want to skip ahead or wait, move on to next week's
car. You're not driving
podcast.
to San Antonio. Yeah. Right.
But essentially what we have here is I think the biggest one pointing to, actually, let me just read from the dissent in the Court of Criminal Appeals case. It says, the morning after he, being Roberson, brought her, being Nikki, to the emergency room where she was found to be limp, lifeless, blue, and bruised. Her pupils were fixed and dilated, and the back of her head exhibited a boggy, mushy bump. Applicant gave inconsistent accounts for Nikki's condition, centering around a possible fall from a bed, an explanation the medical professionals found at odds with her condition. She died days later after life support had been withdrawn. The argument that folks are making is essentially when you hear that kind of injuries, this is not the case of medicine making someone sick and eventually dying or any of these types of things, is that he clearly abused her. There were bruises all over her, leading to her death. What do Roberson's supporters have to say about that case?
I think they have answers to all of those points, and that's sort of the whole. I think people are trying to make conclusions where that's not what anyone's asking the court at this, or was asking the court to do before he was scheduled to execute. I mean, I think they'll say, something that advocates for moving ahead with the execution often point to, I think, is her autopsy report, in addition to some, images of her and those exact descriptions that you mentioned, Matthew. I think his lawyers would say the autopsy itself was really flawed. The practitioner who conducted it was told before she conducted the autopsy of Nikki that Roberson had been arrested on murder charges, which today I think people have argued would taint the autopsy. I think his lawyers have also noted that she had a blood disorder that was caused by all the other illnesses that she had that led her to bruise very easily, and led to those marks that people point to that were reported in the autopsy. People also suggest that she had clear signs of blunt force trauma, and that's clearly what she died from, was somebody hitting her. But in the trial record, the doctors who attended to her testified that blunt force trauma is indistinguishable from shaking, and so those are sort of kind of conflated descriptors in her record that people, I think, are seizing on and drawing conclusions from. I mean, there are just like a bunch of things like that.
Mhm.
It's not an easy like. If the appeals that his lawyers have brought are just it's just pages and pages of medical evaluations, very technical diagnoses and conclusions that they draw from all these different parts of her condition, and so I don't think it's so clear cut.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm going to quote yourself to you. I'm going to quote you to yourself.
Yeah.
Basically, the argument around the medical examiners I thought was a really interesting one. The medical report, again, describing multiple sites of trauma, bruises all over. You mentioned the blood condition that might have potentially contributed to that. One of the things this team points to is, and now I'm quoting you, the treating physicians who first saw Nikki did not make note of multiple sites of physical trauma upon her arrival at the hospital. Since she wasn't admitted with those injuries, and especially because she had that disorder, it's clear they came from 2 days. It's clear that the bruises came from 2 days of being picked up, moved, and manipulated during emergency procedures. This is you're in that. I'm quoting you, quoting a group of lawmakers, essentially saying that. So essentially, this idea of just like what may have happened after she was rushed to the hospital, he possibly is now being blamed for.
Right.
Essentially.
And let me ask, I mean, I know some of the judges have said in this most recent time, but also throughout, sort of like, they're sort of saying like, this is not a shaken baby case. Like the question of whether or not shaken baby syndrome is real or not, or whether the triad, all that, like, is not that like, there is other evidence that he brought about her death that, and some of the, like one of the jurors testified saying like, well, we convicted on the premise of shaken baby. I mean, where does that stand now? Like, it is still a shaken baby case, right?
That is also now in question.
Okay.
And that will be part of what the trial court has to decide of how central was her shaken baby diagnosis to Roberson's conviction. I think we saw in some of the dissenting opinions from the CCA, I think maybe 2 judges said that they did not think this was a shaken baby case, like you said, Eleanor, that, there was blunt force trauma and clear signs that he had brought about her death, not solely through shaking. I think you will hear his lawyers say that that is a absurd case to make, and there are references to shaking and shaken baby syndrome dozens and dozens and dozens times throughout the trial record. Like you said, a juror came out and said that this was solely what they convicted him based on, and that she would change her, decision today if she had been presented with all these other facts. But that will be something that, the court will have to decide.
Yeah, I mean, this is a situation where even the jurors are split, right? Because after the decision from the Court of Criminal Appeals this week, the foreman of the jury came out and told a local television station, he said that the jury did not convict Roberson based on shaken baby syndrome, that there was evidence of blunt force trauma. He kind of quoted the nurses testifying at trial saying that, she was the bluest child one nurse had ever seen. Her face was battered and bloodied. We already kind of talked about some of that background there. But then, of course, you then quote Terry Compton. Everything that was presented to us was all about shaken baby syndrome. That was what our decision was based on. Nothing else was ever mentioned or presented to us to consider. So there's split there. Obviously, you need a unanimous jury in order to convict someone to death. So, could you possibly make the argument that at least one juror is saying that, and that changes things, which sort of leads me to my next question of what exactly are we supposed to be evaluating here? I mean, are we supposed to the courts, when I say we, I really mean the courts here, are the courts supposed to be deciding he's guilty or he's not guilty? Are they supposed to be evaluating, is he guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? Or are they supposed to be evaluating, despite whether they think he's guilty or not guilty, that he deserves a new trial? Or can they decide any of those things?
Right now, I think their remit is far more limited. It's if under, in light of the Andrew Rourke decision out of Dallas County, that, there is sufficient doubt about how Roberson's trial went down to, recommend that he gets a new trial. And then ultimately the CCA will have to decide whether or not that should happen. His lawyers are arguing for his actual innocence, or have been arguing for his actual innocence, which is a much higher bar to clear for the defense than just that he's not guilty. So they are suggesting that they have the evidence and that they know that he is actually innocent and can prove that in court. I think maybe some of his lawmaker supporters are taking a kind of a more conservative approach and saying that there is just enough doubt about the fairness of his trial and that he was afforded the proper due process, and we just shouldn't be executing somebody if there is that doubt, whether or not we think he is actually innocent. So there is a real range of routes that his supporters are pursuing.
And I mean, I think that is what so many death penalty cases come down to, and like they're not usually done in this this level of scrutiny, even when we have had like high profile cases like Melissa Lucio and these other cases that are very high profile. Very rarely, I think, is the evidence played out so publicly, and but often it does come down to more than just like, did they do it or not, right? If so many of these like innocence cases are, did we like follow all of the procedure? Like, was all of this handled correctly? Because the bar is so, I mean, you're putting someone to death. Like, I think the bar for many criminal cases is like, did we, give this person due process? But when the bar for this is so high, like, I think they often succeed on these, not on the merits, but on the, this person was not given due process.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
It's interesting to just hear this conversation about shaken baby syndrome. We actually talked on last week's podcast about how I used to cover criminal trials, and I covered a shaken baby case. In 2009, I went back just before the show and Googled, tried to figure out when it was. And in that case, there was, I think, the medical consensus on shaken baby syndrome had not reached maybe what it is now, but there were people who were casting doubt on it. And I have this memory of sitting there in that trial and thinking, you sort of maybe some people, at least, I'll speak for myself, sit in these trials and they think, the prosecution has no reason to push a certain narrative, but the defense is going to find, has clear motivation to try to make a case about, this isn't real. And so they brought in a witness who, was talking about how the science behind shaken baby syndrome was not quite where it is now. But it's hard to not look at that skeptically when you're thinking, okay, they're going to do anything to try to save their client from this case. It's interesting the person actually was found not guilty in that case, but it does make me think about the junk law, which was passed 4 years later, and how that might cause you to want to reconsider some of those cases. Is if you can demonstrate the changed medical consensus, it might really mean something in the eyes of a jury.
Which is, I think, why this whole thing is so interesting, because I think there are people who are just very, very opposed to, the death penalty in general, and work specifically on death penalty cases, and we might think of them as sort of being one political leaning.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting about this case is it is sort of, like you said, cross-cutting across political leanings, and it's not been as clear cut of just the defense versus the prosecution. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's gotten very, very. I think a lot of lawmakers who are very supportive of the death penalty generally, are very opposed in this case. To this.
Well, Brian Harrison, among, if not the most conservative member of the Texas House, teaming up with Joe Moody, a Democrat, teaming up with Jeff Leach, a Republican, but who does not get along very well with Brian Harrison at all. If you follow them on Twitter, they post shots at each other at times. And then on the other side, you have, Ken Paxton and Mitch Little, also very conservative folks, but, there was a press conference, right, where a big Republican donor, Doug Deason, came out in support of Roberson. And so those kind of mixed alliances have been really interesting to watch. I'm curious as the law and politics reporter, Eleanor.
Yeah, great.
What do you think about just the way this case has been politicized? And there seem to be we had a story about this last week, a lot of concerns around just how so many more court cases are being played out in the court of public opinion as opposed to the weighing of evidence and everything that goes on there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been so interesting. I remember like after that subpoena when we all were like the editors and the readers were like, what does that mean? And we're like, oh, I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. And we were like calling judges who were like, yeah, we don't know either. So it's really, unprecedented in so many ways. But I do think the pressure on the courts around this, I think in some ways is unprecedented. But I also think in a lot of ways, like, I think they feel this degree of pressure on a lot of death penalty cases. Mm-hmm. This is obviously getting even more attention, but like there have been very, very high profile and I think they probably would say like they take all the death penalty cases very seriously. But we're seeing just a lot of, the Court of Criminal Appeals itself is, after the last election became much more aligned with Attorney General Ken Paxton, who helped unseat 3 incumbents. And
because he disagreed with the ruling that they issued. Yeah.
He disagreed with their ruling on on a voting rights case or election fraud case. And he, has been very overt about like being willing to do that again and going to continue to do that. 2 current incumbents are not going to run for re-election again. We saw with the Texas Supreme Court recently with when the quorum break happened and Paxton and Abbott both went to the Texas Supreme Court saying like remove these people from their seats. And Michael Quinn Sullivan, sort of a conservative commentator, saying, to the Texas Supreme Court on Twitter, like, Republican primary voters are watching what you do on this. So a lot of very overt politicization of the courts. I will say, like, at least from so far, from an outsider's perspective, there's not a ton of evidence that the courts are bowing to that, right? The Texas Supreme Court did not expel those House members yet. At least we don't have a ruling. The Court of Criminal Appeals did, we've seen this in other rulings, but also in this ruling, sort of, it seems like remain somewhat consistent with their previous rulings on this. So, but I have to imagine they're feeling that pressure.
Yeah, no one has said this to me, but as I watched the defense on this and having press conferences with a big Republican donor or having people like Brian Harrison and Jeff Leach come out in favor of them, I've got to think that one of the reasons they're using those voices is to try to send a signal to the Court of Criminal Appeals that says, you will get some support from your rightward flank if you make what we feel is the right decision here.
That's what Doug Deason said
explicitly.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And the thing about being a judge on the Court of Criminal Appeals is nobody knows who the hell you are, right? I don't mean that in a derogatory manner.
That's their
it's just
hope.
like
right.
That's more derogatory about the voters than it is about the judges. But just like people don't know the names of the 9 statewide elected Court of Criminal Appeals. You also have to elect 9 Supreme Court members, and you have to elect your local judges, and you have to elect your Court of Appeals judges and your state representative and all these different other things. Like, it's just really hard to keep track of that kind of thing. So the risk there is one little case that people can glom onto could bring you down. And you have to think about that. I think it's probably impossible not to have that weigh on the back of your head, even if you're going to do the right thing and try to block it out and make that, go away and make the decision based on the law and the facts. But maybe what they're trying to say here is exactly right. Like, it's not just this is not a case where the hardline Republican primary voters is unanimous in thinking this guy needs to be executed right now.
Yeah, I think Ken Paxton has really posed the only like meaningful threat to these judges who are elected largely. Like, if you're an incumbent, you can get reelected
based on your name, basically.
Right, yeah. There was a huge scandal probably 20 years ago with a Court of Criminal Appeals judge who was really in the spotlight after she refused to let a lawyer file an appeal. Like, they were like 20 minutes late, and she locked the door, and it was this huge national news story, and she was like condemned from by everyone.
And this was on a death row case.
On a death row case, and he ended up being executed because the lawyer was a few minutes late to file the filing, and she locked the door and wouldn't let him file it. It was national news, and still she served another 20 years on the court, reelected every year until she ran into the brick wall that is Ken Paxton and was unseated last term. So, I think for a long time they haven't really had to contend with this level of political pressure. It is probably easier for them to hear from a major Republican donor.
Yeah.
If they try to do that to you on this, we're here to back you.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
So, Kayla, where do we go from here?
Well, it's sort of unclear. The Court of Criminal Appeals in its order didn't lay out a timeline for the Anderson County Court to act. This could very well be another years-long process. When the CCA stayed his execution in 2016, basically did a very similar thing that they did on Thursday. They stayed in 2016. I think COVID had some things to do with it, but there wasn't an evidentiary hearing until 2021 to 2021-ish, 4 or 5 years later. And his execution wasn't set again until 8 years after that initial stay. So it could be a really long process or not. I don't know. Maybe how public it has become will change the timeline. Another outstanding question is whether the Attorney General's office is going to continue representing the state in this part of the case. Again, obviously, Ken Paxton's been very vocal about what he thinks, and his office is now, representing the state. So it's hard to imagine that if they continue doing that they will concede any of these points. So that is kind of all still up in the air. And I think all of the claims that Roberson's attorneys have been making on his behalf, even though some of them were dismissed by the CCA this latest round, I think what's included in them, the facts of those or the claims made in them are still going to be relevant as they make his case this time around in Anderson County.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like maybe we're falling into a pattern here, though, where the Court of Criminal Appeals sends it back and the court on the ground, the district court, does not seem very interested in changing, the result of this. And then it comes back to this, what's going to break that cycle either way. I think we'll have to see.
Well, potentially some new faces on the Court of Criminal Appeals.
Yeah,
if we've got 2 people stepping down. Yeah.
That could be. Okay. Well, that is all we have for today. Thank you to our producers, Rob and Chris, and thank you, Kayla. We will talk to you all next week.